Hello, and welcome to this week's thought. Back in 2019, pre-pandemic, when we were allowed to travel, my wife and I visited Israel as part of an organised tour. We travelled to places where Jesus once walked and taught, and there were many moments that were very moving for us. One of those moments was when we visited a particular beach near the village of Tabka on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, the place where Jesus appeared to the disciples after his resurrection. The incident is recorded in the 21st chapter of John's Gospel. Allow me to remind you of the story. After the emotional roller coaster of the previous weeks, the high of Palm Sunday, the descent to the depths of utter despair at the crucifixion, and then the glory of the resurrection, the disciples had returned to Galilee. The Gospels tell us, of course, that Jesus had told them to do this. We read in Matthew chapter 28, verse 10, that he said to the women on their way to tell the disciples that the tomb was empty, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." So here they were, in Galilee, fishing. However, even as experienced fishermen, they'd been out all night and caught nothing. At daybreak, someone hails them from the shore, speaking colloquially and saying something like, "Hey lads, haven't caught any fish, have you? Try there on the right side and you'll catch some." Now, I think if I'd have been on that boat, I'm not sure what my reaction would have been to this. But anyhow, the disciples did as directed and were amazed when they caught a huge number of fish. At this point, they suddenly realized that it was Jesus who was addressing them. Peter, impetuous as ever, jumps off the boat and runs to greet Jesus, leaving the rest of the disciples to land the catch. We then get the lovely image of Jesus inviting them to share breakfast with him. A few things stand out for me from this story. The first is how Jesus reveals the secret of effective mission. The disciples had fished all night and they caught nothing. However, when they did as Jesus directed, they caught lots of fish. Perhaps they remembered later what Jesus had said when he was teaching about the vine and the branches, as recorded in John chapter 15. "Apart from me, you can do nothing." And perhaps this is something to say to us about how we witness. Often we plan strategies and teach methodologies plundered from studies of psychology and sociology, but the results are disappointing. There was nothing wrong with the disciples' knowledge about fishing. The problem was that they were relying on it. When they placed their trust in Jesus and did how he directed, the harvest was overwhelming. So what does this mean for us in practice? In the words attributed to the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, we need to find out what God is doing and join in. How do we do this? I would suggest it's through a well-developed prayer life, in which we start by confessing our total reliance on God and allow him to shape our ideas and thinking. It's realizing that what we can do without Jesus is not a little, it's nothing. We need to place our reliance fully in him rather than in our own strategies and abilities. The second thought about this passage is that it speaks to us about the nature of our relationship with Jesus. The invitation to share a meal has a much greater significance in the East than it perhaps does for us. It signifies a desire for a deeper relationship, for true fellowship. It is based on Jesus' initiative, verse 12, and is practical, expressed amid the everyday realities of hard work, professional skills, and the preparing of meals. We remember another time when Jesus was practical, in the upper room when he washed the disciples' feet. And we're reminded of Paul's words in his letter to the Philippians, "And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. When Chris and I were standing on the shoreline, looking out over the sea, another thing that struck us was the quietness of the place. It struck us that if we'd been tasked to organise Jesus' reappearance to the disciples, it would perhaps have been a much more dramatic affair, probably involving mass trumpets and a fly-past of the heavenly host. Again, if we think about that first Easter morning, God could have chosen to make the news of Christ's resurrection known in any number of dramatic ways, but instead he chose ordinary, imperfect men and women to tell the world this greatest of news. During Lent, in our Connect group, we read Hannah Steele's book, Living His Story, the Archbishop of Canterbury's Lent book for this year. The author suggests practical ways of sharing the gospel story afresh. She shows us how we can live Jesus' story in our own lives, simply by being the people God made us, and allowing people to be drawn to him through our natural gifts. It's a book that changes the way we think about evangelism and fills us with confidence to share God's love with the people around us. We have a mission coming up in September, Believe in Bolton, with Canon J. John as the main speaker. We need to be thinking now about who we might invite to those evenings. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's a neighbour. Perhaps it's a work colleague. Or perhaps a friend. If you haven't read Hannah Steele's book, I thoroughly recommend that you do. I'll close by reading an excerpt from her conclusion. On that first Easter morning, God could have chosen to make the news of Jesus' miraculous resurrection known in any number of ways. He could have emblazoned a declaration across the sky so that all could have seen it and not doubted its veracity. He could have had Jesus appear alive in the presence of the crowd who'd bayed for his death. However, God chose the lips of ordinary women, whose hearts were broken with grief, now erupting with joy, to be the vessels through which he would pass on this life-changing news. God chose ordinary people, with personal stories of redemption and imperfect words, to tell the greatest news that there's ever been. God continues to use people like you and me to share the life-changing news of the gospel of Jesus. We are the ordinary people for whom God is bringing about a revolution of his extraordinary love. The mandate to go and make disciples remains the same, but the context is different. There is no guarantee that our experience of witness will be easy. We should certainly not underestimate the challenges that lie before us. Our task is to engage in evangelism that is both beautiful and imaginative. We are to bear witness in such a way that speaks to people's hearts and minds, connecting their stories with God's great story, so that in Christ they might find new life and meaning. Let us hear his voice, calling to us, as it did to Mary that first Easter morning. Go and tell. As we seek to live the story of the gospel, we are privileged to reveal his extraordinary love in ordinary ways, putting our name to his story and inviting others to join us as we do so. There is no task more urgent or wonderful than this. Thank you for listening.